Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a sealed letter waiting on your desk tonight, its wax unbroken, its secret still your own? Watson once learned that even the most respectable seal can hide an altered hand if one forgets to look closely. Do subscribe so no forgery escapes your notice. Now, lean in. For as Holmes believed, it is the small things that are infinitely the most important. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked below. Chapter 1. The Respectable Circle of St. Aldwyn's. It has been my habit in setting down these records of my friend Sherlock Holmes's investigations to begin where the disturbance first shows itself upon the smooth surface of ordinary life. Rarely have I encountered a surface so smooth, nor a disturbance so slight in its first appearance, as in the affair which I have come to call the case of the Tampered Committal Warrant. It began not in a darkened alley, nor at the scene of violence, but amid the candlelight and courteous laughter of an annual dinner, in the company of some of the most respectable persons in London. I had been invited, through the kindness of an old army acquaintance, to attend the yearly dinner of St. Aldwyn's Benevolent Association, a society of barristers, clerks, magistrates, physicians and reformers who devoted their leisure hours to charitable work among the poor of the eastern parishes. It was, I confess, not the sort of gathering that would ordinarily have drawn me from Baker Street, but my friend had been occupied for some days with a tedious matter of forged bank drafts, and I welcomed the chance of an evening's diversion. The dinner was held in a handsome room above a chop-house near the Temple, with dark panelling and portraits of former presidents gazing down upon us with the settled dignity of men who'd never doubted their own respectability. I found myself seated near a Mr. Charles Venn, a solicitor of perhaps 45 years, whose manner was so easy, and whose conversation so agreeably varied that I marked him at once as a man well used to putting others at ease. Across the table sat Miss Eleanor March, a lecturer on prison reform, whose earnestness of expression suggested a woman not easily deceived by comfortable arrangements, and beside her the Reverend Caleb Sykes, chaplain to one of the city jails, a heavy grave man whose voice, when he spoke, carried the settled cadence of the pulpit even in matters of small talk. Inspector Bradstreet, whom I had met on former occasions in connection with Holmes's work, was present as a guest of the society, and greeted me with the guarded cordiality of a policeman among civilians. The toast of the evening was given to a young magistrate, Mr. Leonard Fairley, a slight, fair man of perhaps 30 years, whose honesty and diligence were praised by the chairman in terms that might have embarrassed a less modest recipient. Fairley bore the compliments with a becoming awkwardness, and it was clear that the assembled company held him in genuine affection. It was only towards the close of the evening, as the company began to disperse into smaller knots about the room, that Fairley drew me aside with an air of some discomfort. "Dr. Watson," said he, lowering his voice, "you are acquainted, I believe, with Mr. Sherlock Holmes." I told him that I had that honour, and inquired whether I might be of some service. "It is a delicate matter," said he, glancing about him as though the portraits themselves might overhear, "and I confess I hardly know whether it rises to the dignity of a mystery, or is merely some clerical blunder that will resolve itself upon proper inquiry. A committal warrant, concerning a prisoner named Abel Crowther, has gone missing from a sealed packet in my office. The packet was found in its proper place upon my desk, the seal apparently undisturbed, yet the warrant is not there." "That sounds serious enough," I said. "It is embarrassing, certainly," he replied, with the particular distress of a conscientious man confronted by disorder in his own domain. "But I cannot think it criminal. Everyone concerned in the handling of that packet is a person of the most unimpeachable character. I should as soon suspect the Archbishop of Canterbury as any member of this society. I confess that I thought little more of the matter that evening, taking it for the sort of administrative confusion that afflicts every busy office from time to time. But when I related the conversation to Holmes upon my return to Baker Street, he set down his pipe and regarded me with that particular stillness which I had learned to associate with the awakening of his interest. A sealed packet, undisturbed, and yet a document is missing from within it," said he slowly. "That is either a very clumsy trick or a very clever one, Watson, and I confess I have small patience for the clumsy sort." Fairley seemed to think it could not be the work of anyone in the society, I observed. He spoke as though respectability were itself a kind of alibi. Holmes gave a short, dry laugh, and reached again for his pipe. "Respectability, my dear fellow, is often the best disguise ever invented. A man in a shabby coat is watched by every constable on his beat. A man in a good coat, with a good voice and the right acquaintance, may walk through the most guarded doors in London without a single question asked him. I should be very much surprised if this Mr. Fairley's difficulty proves to be the work of some outsider skulking at the margins of his respectable circle. It is far more likely, I think, to have originated at its very centre. I confess I thought this a rather severe judgment, founded upon nothing more than my own brief account of an evening's conversation, but I had learned, in the years of our association, that Holmes's instincts, however lightly expressed, were rarely without foundation, and I went to bed that night with the uneasy sense that the pleasant company of St. Aldwyn's Benevolent Association harboured, somewhere within its polished and well-meaning circle, a secret less charitable than any of its members would have cared to admit. Chapter 2. The Man with the Perfect Reputation. Fairley presented himself at Baker Street the following morning, somewhat earlier than the hour at which Holmes commonly received visitors, and I found him standing upon the landing in a state of visible agitation, his hat still in his hand as though he had forgotten, in his haste, to relinquish it to Mrs. Hudson below. "I am glad you have come," said Holmes, waving him to the basket chair by the fire. "Watson's account of the matter last night was suggestive, but a second-hand suggestion is a poor substitute for the thing itself. Pray tell me everything, and omit nothing on the ground that it seems trivial. It is precisely the trivial matters, in my experience, that prove the most instructive." Fairley seated himself, though he did not appear at ease. "The prisoner in question," he began, "is a man named Abel Crowther, a dock labourer who was committed for trial after a violent quarrel with a wealthy shipping agent named Josiah Renner. The quarrel arose, I understand, from some dispute over wages, and ended with Crowther striking Renner and causing him a considerable injury. The case was clear enough, and I signed the committal warrant myself in the usual form before witnesses." "Where was the warrant kept after signing?" asked Holmes. "It was sealed into a legal packet, along with certain supporting depositions, and placed in my private office to await transfer to the Clerk of Sessions. This is our invariable custom, and I can assure you the packet never left my sight until it was locked away." "And yet," said Holmes, "you tell us the warrant within it was found to be altered." "Altered, yes, though the packet itself showed no sign of tampering. The seal appeared whole when it was opened before the Clerk of Sessions 2 days later. But when the warrant was examined, it was found that the prisoner's name, the date, and even the particular charge had been subtly changed. The document, as it now stands, appears to concern an entirely different man. I confess I found this circumstance more perplexing than any ordinary theft could have been." "But surely," I said, "if the seal was unbroken, the alteration must have taken place before the packet was sealed at all." "That is the obvious inference," Holmes agreed, "and obvious inferences are worth examining chiefly for the purpose of discovering why they are wrong. Mr. Fairley, who besides yourself had access to that packet before it was sealed?" Fairley hesitated. "My clerk, of course, and I suppose any person who might have had occasion to enter my office during the half-hour or so that elapsed between the signing and the sealing. But I can vouch for every one of them. They are none of them the sort of persons who—" He stopped, as though hearing in his own words an echo of the very assumption Holmes had warned me against the night before. "Who could conceivably stoop to forgery?" Holmes finished for him, not unkindly. "Quite so. And yet someone has done precisely that. Let us set aside, for the present, the question of who could not have done it, and consider instead who might have had reason to. Has any suspicion fallen upon a particular person?" Fairley's discomfort deepened visibly. "There is a young woman," he said reluctantly, Miss Lydia Voss, who was engaged to be married to Crowther. She came to my office some days before the warrant was sealed, begging most piteously for his release, or at least for some mitigation of the charge. I was obliged to refuse her, of course, the matter being entirely outside my discretion. She was seen near my office again on the day the packet was sealed, and a witness has since come forward who claims to have heard her speaking with what he describes as a foreign sharpness in her voice, and to have seen her wearing a dark veil, of a sort not commonly worn by English women. A foreign sharpness, Holmes repeated with the faintest inflection of interest. That is a curious phrase for a witness to employ of his own accord. And what is known of this Miss Voss? Very little, beyond her devotion to Crowther. I am told her people were of foreign extraction, though she herself was raised in England. Her grief at his arrest has been extreme, and I am bound to say that grief of that intensity is capable of leading a person to actions they would not otherwise contemplate. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the window, where he stood for a moment looking down into the street below, his hands clasped behind him in the attitude I had come to recognise as denoting close reflection. "Tell me," said he without turning, "was anything said of the gloves this young woman wore?" Fairley appeared startled by the question. "Her gloves? I believe the witness mentioned them now that you ask. Dark gloves, closely fitted. Why do you ask such a thing?" "Because a woman distracted by grief to the point of forging a legal document is not commonly a woman who attends to the fit of her gloves," said Holmes. "And because it interests me a great deal more that this witness should have noticed her accent, her veil, and her gloves, than that Miss Voss should have known where the warrant was kept." "Did she in fact know this?" "She's said to have known precisely where it was kept," Fairley admitted, "though I cannot say how she should have come by such knowledge, unless it were through Crowther himself, who had visited my office on a former occasion regarding a debt matter, and might have observed the arrangement of my desk." Holmes said nothing further upon the subject for some minutes, but questioned Fairley closely as to the exact times at which the packet had been signed, witnessed, and sealed, and as to the names of every person who had passed through his outer office during that interval. He wrote nothing down, yet I observed that he attended to each answer with the particular intensity that told me he was constructing, within his own mind, some structure of times and movements whose shape was not yet clear even to himself. "I think," said he at last, "that we'd better examine this warrant with our own eyes before we examine anyone's character further. Character, Mr. Fairley, is a most unreliable witness. It will swear to anything a jury wishes to hear. A document, on the other hand, cannot help but tell the truth, provided one knows how to make it speak. Can you procure for us an hour's access to the warrant this afternoon?" Fairley assured him that this could be arranged, and took his leave somewhat comforted, though I could see that the mention of Miss Voss's gloves had left him more troubled than before, as though Holmes had, with a single question, disturbed some comfortable certainty he had not known he possessed. "You're not persuaded of her guilt," I said, when the door had closed behind our visitor. "I'm not persuaded of anything yet, Watson," Holmes replied, reaching for his pipe, "save that a witness who remembers a woman's accent, her veil, and the fit of her gloves, all in the same breath, has either an uncommonly retentive memory or an uncommonly convenient one. We shall know better which, I think, before the day is out." Chapter 3. The Altered Document. We arrived at Fairley's chambers a little after 2 o'clock, the afternoon being grey and close, with a thin rain beginning to streak the windows of the cab as we turned into the narrow court behind the Sessions House. Fairley himself met us at the stairhead and conducted us through an outer office, where a pale young clerk sat copying at a high desk, to his own private room, a small but orderly chamber lined with deed boxes and shelves of calf-bound statutes. The warrant itself lay upon the desk, and Holmes bent over it at once with his lens, examining it with a silence so prolonged that Fairley began to shift uneasily upon his feet. "The forgery is skilful," said Holmes at length, "but it is not perfect, and imperfection, Watson, is our most valuable ally in matters of this kind. Observe the crossing of the letter T in the word committed. It is done with a single decisive stroke, slightly curved, in a manner that is not taught in any English writing school I have encountered. And here, in the word Crowther itself, the capital C begins with a small looped flourish before the main curve, a habit I have seen before only in persons trained upon the continent. "You think a foreigner wrote this?" I asked. "I think a person trained in a foreign hand wrote this," Holmes corrected, "which is not quite the same thing. A man may acquire such habits without ever having left these shores if he was taught his letters by a foreign master or spent his formative years abroad. It is a thread, Watson, not a rope, and I do not propose to hang anyone upon it." Bradstreet, who had joined us at Fairley's request, examined the document with the frown of a man who has already reached his own conclusion and finds himself mildly inconvenienced by the necessity of appearing to reconsider it. "It is plain enough to me," said he. "The woman Voss learned where the warrant lay, came in some disguise, and altered it in a fit of desperation, meaning to save her lover from the dock by making the charge appear to concern some other man entirely. Foreign hand or no, it points the same way." "Does it?" said Holmes mildly. "Then perhaps you will explain to me, Inspector, why a woman acting in desperation, with only a few stolen minutes at her disposal, should trouble herself to alter 3 separate particulars upon a document with such care and consistency, rather than simply destroying the warrant altogether, or removing it from the packet as Mr. Fairley first supposed had been done. Destruction is the work of a moment and requires no skill whatever. This required time, a steady hand, and no small knowledge of exactly what alterations would produce the desired effect." Bradstreet had no ready answer to this, and contented himself with the observation that desperate people did not always act sensibly. Holmes said nothing further upon the point, but turned his attention instead to the room itself, moving about it with the quick, bird-like alertness that told me his interest had shifted from the document to its surroundings. He examined the desk closely, then the floor beside it, and presently uttered a small exclamation of satisfaction, stooping to lift something from the carpet with his fingers, which he held up for our inspection, a single thread of fine black wool scarcely an inch in length. "This was caught upon the corner of the desk," said he, "where a person leaning over the packet might easily have brushed against it. It is a good wool, close woven, of the kind used in gentlemen's coats rather than in a woman's cloak, though I do not say that is conclusive." He placed the thread carefully within an envelope from his pocket-book, and turned next to the blotting paper that lay beside the inkstand. "There is a scent here," he said, bending close. "Faint, but distinct. Violet, I think, though not the common variety sold at every chemist's. It is a finer preparation, and has been pressed into the blotting paper as though a scented glove or handkerchief rested upon it for some minutes." Fairley, who had been listening with mounting distress, ventured that Miss Voss was known to favour violet scent, a fact he had heard mentioned by more than one person in the office. "That is interesting," said Holmes, "though I would remind you that violet is not so rare a preference as to identify its wearer beyond dispute. Half the women in London might answer to it, and not a few men besides, who affect scented handkerchiefs for reasons of their own." He straightened, and his eye fell upon a small disc of red sealing wax that lay, half crushed, near the edge of the desk. "And here is something further. Mr. Fairley, what wax is used in this office for the sealing of illegal packets?" "A dark crimson, of good quality, supplied by our regular stationers," Fairley replied. "I have used no other in all my years here." Holmes held the fragment to the light. "This is lighter in shade, and contains, if I am not mistaken, a trace of vermilion not present in the office wax. It did not come from your supply, Mr. Fairley, which suggests that whoever handled this packet on the occasion in question brought their own materials with them, perhaps to reseal something they had opened, and either dropped this fragment by accident or discarded it in haste." Bradstreet, who had followed this demonstration with visible impatience, folded his arms. "All very ingenious, Mr. Holmes, but threads and scents and scraps of wax do not alter the fact that Lydia Voss was seen entering this building on the day in question, was heard speaking with a foreign accent, and was known to want above all things to save her lover from the dock. I do not see that your discoveries clear her of anything." "I have not said they clear her," Holmes replied. "I have said only that they raise a question which the theory of her guilt does not answer. If Miss Voss, driven by love and desperation, contrived to enter this office and alter this warrant, why should she trouble to alter the name and date with such patient skill, when the destruction of the document would have served her purpose more simply, more quickly, and with far less risk of detection? A woman fleeing in fear does not pause to practice continental capitals, Inspector. That is the work of someone who wished not merely to save Crowther, but to do so in a particular manner and for a particular reason of their own." To this Bradstreet made no immediate reply, though I saw doubt working visibly upon his heavy features for the first time since our arrival. Fairley, for his part, looked from one of us to the other with the expression of a man who had hoped for reassurance, and found instead that his difficulty had grown deeper rather than more shallow beneath Holmes's questioning. As for myself, I confess that the image of the fine black thread, the faint violet scent and the fragment of foreign wax remained with me long after we had left that quiet office, 3 small and silent witnesses to a hand I could not yet see. Chapter 4. A Crime of Passion, or so it seems. Miss Lydia Voss was brought before us the following day, at Bradstreet's arrangement, in a small waiting room adjoining the Sessions House, a place of hard chairs and unshaded gas that seemed designed by its very bareness to strip away any pretension a visitor might bring into it. She was a slight woman of perhaps 25, dark-haired, with the kind of pale, expressive face that shows every passing emotion before the mind. Behind it has quite decided whether to permit the display. When we entered, she was seated with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, and she rose at once, her eyes moving swiftly from Bradstreet to Holmes to myself, as though seeking among us some sign of which she might expect kindness. "I have told the inspector everything I know," she said before any of us had spoken, "and I will tell it again, though I do not see what good it can do Abel now." "We should be glad to hear it once more," said Holmes gently, taking the chair opposite her while Bradstreet remained standing near the door in the attitude of a man determined not to be swayed by sympathy. "Take your own time, Miss Voss." She admitted readily enough that she'd gone to Fairley's office some days before the sealing of the packet, to beg for mercy on Crowther's behalf, and that she had been turned away, the matter being beyond the magistrate's discretion. She'd gone again, she said, on the day the packet was sealed, but only to stand for a time in the street outside, unable to bring herself either to enter or to leave. "I did not go in," she said, and here her composure broke a little, her voice rising with a passion that seemed to me entirely unstudied. "I could not. I stood there like a fool, weeping into my glove until a policeman moved me along. That is the whole of my crime, Dr. Watson, if crime it is, to have loved a man enough to make a spectacle of myself in a public street." Bradstreet, unmoved, reminded her that a witness had seen her leaving the building itself, by the side staircase, and not merely standing without it. "Then your witness is mistaken, or he is lying," she said, with a flash of temper that did her cause no service in Bradstreet's eyes, though I observed Holmes lean forward very slightly at the words, as though they interested him more than her tears had done. It was this witness, a junior clerk named Pomeroy, whom we sought out next, finding him at his high desk in the outer office, a thin, sandy-haired young man with an anxious, deferential manner that seemed to invite reassurance even before any question had been put to him. He repeated his account with a readiness that struck me, upon reflection, as somewhat at odds with the reluctance one might expect of a man giving evidence against a woman in such evident distress. "I saw her plainly, sir," he said to Holmes, "coming down the side stair not 10 minutes before the packet was carried to the sessions clerk. She wore a dark veil, but I knew her by her figure and by her voice, for she was murmuring to herself as she went, something about the warrant, with a foreign sharpness to her words that I could not mistake. You're certain of the word warrant in particular? Holmes asked. Quite certain, sir. She said it twice, I think, or perhaps 3 times. And the accent, Holmes pursued. Can you describe it more exactly? Was it French, German, or of some other character? Here Pomeroy hesitated, his earlier fluency deserting him. I could not rightly say, sir. Foreign only, as I have described it. I am no judge of such refinements. Holmes asked him several further questions, touching upon the exact hour, the precise appearance of the veil, and the manner of Miss Voss's descent upon the stair, and I observed that Pomeroy answered each with the same curious quality I had noted from the first, a fluency upon certain points and a vagueness upon others, as though he had rehearsed a part without troubling to imagine the whole scene from which it was supposedly drawn. When we had taken our leave, Holmes remarked upon this at once. You noticed it, Watson, I am sure, said he as we walked from the building. A man who has truly witnessed a thing remembers it unevenly, brightly in one particular and dimly in another, according to no order but that of his own attention. Pomeroy remembers the veil, the staircase, and the word warrant with perfect clarity, and remembers nothing whatever of the accent he claims first drew his notice. That is not the memory of an eye, it is the memory of an ear that has been told what to repeat. We had occasion, before the day was done, to call upon Reverend Sykes, whom we found in his rooms near the jail, surrounded by devotional volumes and the faint, persistent odour of tallow candles. He received us with grave courtesy, and when Holmes turned the conversation to Miss Voss, the chaplain shook his heavy head with an air of genuine sorrow. I fear for that young woman, said he. She came to me once, some weeks before this trouble began, in a state of great agitation, and declared to me in words I've not forgotten that she would change the law itself if the law would not change for Abel Crowther. I did not think much of it at the time, taking it for the extravagance of a distressed heart. I confess it wears a darker aspect now. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow very slightly at this recital, though he made no comment beyond thanking the Reverend gravely for his candour, and we took our leave shortly afterward. That is a damning phrase, if it was truly spoken, I ventured, once we were again in the street. It is a phrase remarkably well suited to the theory Inspector Bradstreet has already formed, Holmes replied, which is not quite the same thing as being true, though I do not say the Reverend has spoken falsely. A grieving woman may say many things in the heat of despair that she does not mean in the letter, and a listener predisposed to find her guilty may remember such things with a clarity that flatters his own judgment rather more than it serves the truth. We have now, Watson, a witness who cannot describe what he claims to have heard, and a chaplain who recalls, with suspicious precision, a single sentence spoken weeks before the crime it now appears to explain. Some lies, my friend, are built not from falsehood, but from a careful arrangement of truths, each harmless enough alone, and it is that arrangement, rather than any single stone within it, that I mean to examine next. Chapter 5. Genuine Tears and Practised Trembling. It was Holmes's custom, when a case had reached a certain density of conflicting testimony, to withdraw from the pursuit of any single witness, and consider instead the whole company of persons touched by the affair, weighing one against another as a jeweller weighs stones of doubtful value, not by their own account of themselves, but by the quality of light they gave off under close examination. It was in this spirit that we spent the greater part of the following day renewing our acquaintance with the members of St. Aldwyn's Benevolent Association, whom I had first met at that ill-fated dinner. We found Miss Eleanor March at a mission house near Whitechapel, engaged in the distribution of tracts and warm broth to a queue of ragged women, and she broke off her work at once upon hearing our errand, her face darkening with a concern that seemed to me entirely without artifice. It is monstrous, she said, that suspicion should fall upon Lydia Voss merely because she loved a man enough to weep for him in public. I have known women broken by grief to do stranger things than stand outside an office window, Mr. Holmes, and I have never yet known one of them to forge a legal document with a steady hand. Grief does not lend itself to penmanship. You know Miss Voss personally, then? Holmes inquired. I have visited her twice since her trouble began. She spoke of nothing but Abel Crowther, and of the injustice of a system that would hang a man for the crime of losing his temper against one who has wronged him for years. I do not say she is a saint, Mr. Holmes. I say only that her fault, if fault it is, lies in the excess of her feeling, not in its calculation. Her indignation continued for some minutes, sincere, I thought, in every particular, and touched with the especial passion of one whose life's work had taught her to distrust the comfortable judgments of respectable society. Holmes listened with close attention, and I observed that he asked her nothing further about Lydia Voss, but turned instead to inquire, almost carelessly, whether she had ever had occasion to visit Fairlie's office herself. "Once or twice, in connection with petitions," she replied, somewhat surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" "Merely completing my picture of the ground," said Holmes, and turned the conversation to other matters before taking his leave. Our next call was upon Mr. Venn, whom we discovered in his chambers near Lincoln's Inn, a handsome suite of rooms furnished with the quiet good taste of a man who had never found it necessary to display his prosperity too openly. He received us with the same easy courtesy I remembered from the dinner, offered us sherry, which Holmes declined and I accepted, and expressed himself entirely at our disposal. "A distressing business," said he, shaking his head with an air of measured sorrow. "I have known Fairlie these 10 years, and a more conscientious magistrate does not sit on the bench. As for Miss Voss, I confess I incline to think her more foolish than wicked, though I do not envy Bradstreet the task of proving it either way." His sympathy, I noted, was expressed in terms so exactly proportioned, so evenly divided between compassion for Fairlie's embarrassment and forbearance toward Lydia Voss's supposed folly, that it seemed less the outpouring of genuine feeling than the practised summation of a man well used to addressing a jury. When Holmes inquired, in the same idle manner he had employed with Miss March, whether Venn had occasion to visit Fairlie's office in the days before the packet was sealed, Venn answered without the least hesitation that he had called there twice upon unrelated business, and could furnish the dates if required. "That will not be necessary at present," said Holmes, and I thought I detected beneath his level tone a certain sharpening of interest that Venn's very readiness had provoked rather than allayed. We returned once more to the Sessions House, where we found Pomeroy at his desk, and here Holmes's questioning took a different temper altogether. The clerk's nervousness, which I had remarked at our first meeting, seemed now to ebb and flow according to some pattern I could not at first discern, growing acute when Bradstreet's name was mentioned, and subsiding curiously whenever Holmes turned the talk to matters of no apparent consequence, such as the ordinary routine of the office or the health of Pomeroy's mother, of whom he spoke with evident and unforced affection. "He's anxious," Holmes observed, once we had left the building. "But his anxiety is not constant, Watson, and inconstant anxiety is a most instructive thing. A man who fears discovery of his own guilt is uneasy always, beneath every question, however trivial. Pomeroy is uneasy only when the conversation touches upon the very matters he has professed to know with such confidence, and easy again the moment it wanders elsewhere. That is not the discomfort of guilt, I think, but the discomfort of a man required to hold a lesson in his memory that he has not fully mastered." It was as we walked back toward the Strand that a messenger boy sent by Fairlie to find us overtook us with a piece of intelligence that Holmes received with unmistakable satisfaction. A carrier employed by the Sessions Office recalled delivering a legal packet to Fairlie's chambers on the very morning in question, and had been questioned that afternoon by one of Bradstreet's constables as a matter of routine. "He says he handed it to a man he took for Mr. Fairlie's clerk," the boy reported, breathless with his own importance, "wearing the right coat and carrying the right satchel, and knowing just where the packet ought to go. But he told the constable something curious besides, sir. He said the clerk's boots were far too fine for a clerk's wages, polished black boots such as a gentleman might wear, and it struck him odd at the time, though he thought no more of it till he was asked." Holmes stood quite still for a moment upon the pavement, and I saw in his face that quickening of purpose which told me, more surely than any words could have done, that some new and decisive thread had been laid before him. "Boots, Watson," he said softly as the boy hurried away, "are a thing men forget to disguise, however carefully they may arrange their coat and their satchel and their borrowed manner. I begin to suspect that the person who handled this warrant did not enter Fairlie's office as Lydia Voss, in a veil and a foreign accent got up for the occasion, but as someone altogether more trusted and altogether more difficult to suspect, a man who wore the coat of a clerk and the boots of a gentleman, and who counted, I think, upon no one ever thinking to look below the hem of his trousers." Chapter 6. The Shape of an Impostor. Holmes spent the whole of the following morning bent over a sheet of foolscap upon which he had ruled a rough table of hours, and I confess that when I looked over his shoulder at the array of names and times set down in his small, precise hand, I could make little of it beyond a general impression of order imposed upon confusion. "The warrant was signed at 10:30, said he, without looking up, "witnessed at 11:15, and sealed into the packet by Fairlie's own hand no later than 11. It was carried to the Sessions office by the messenger boy at 11:30, and there it remained, under the clerk's supervision, until it was opened before witnesses 2 days later. If the alteration was made after the sealing, as the unbroken state of the seal itself seems to contradict, then it must have been made within that narrow half-hour between signing and sealing in Fairlie's own office by someone who had both the opportunity and the skill to do so unobserved." "But Fairlie himself said the packet never left his sight," I objected. "He said it never left the office," Holmes corrected. "A man may be present in a room, and yet not watch every corner of it every moment, particularly if he is engaged, as Fairlie was that morning, in receiving 2 further visitors upon unrelated business, as his own appointment book confirms. It is precisely in such intervals of half attention that the boldest deceptions are practised, Watson, for a man watches most carelessly what he believes himself to be watching most closely." It was in pursuit of this narrow interval that we returned once more to the Sessions House, where Holmes fell into conversation with the elder clerk who kept the attendance book, a dry, meticulous old fellow named Grigson, who took evident pride in the completeness of his records. From him we learned a fact that had not before been mentioned to us, that Pomeroy had been absent from his duties for the better part of a fortnight in the weeks preceding the warrant's alteration, laid low, as he understood it, by a feverish complaint, and that during this absence his duties had been performed by a substitute. "A quiet young fellow," said Grigson, consulting his book, "introduced to us by Mr. Venn himself as a clerk formerly in his own employ who wished for temporary occupation. He gave the name of Ashby, and gave no trouble at all, doing his work neatly and keeping much to himself. He left us the very day Pomeroy returned, and I have not seen him since." "Did anyone verify this Ashby's character beyond Mr. Venn's introduction?" Holmes asked. Grigson seemed faintly surprised by the question. "Verify it, sir? Mr. Venn is a solicitor of the highest standing and has sent us competent men before now. It did not occur to any of us to demand references, when the recommendation itself came from so respectable a quarter." Holmes thanked him with a warmth that seemed to gratify the old clerk considerably, and it was not until we had regained the street that he permitted himself any comment upon what we had heard. "There it is, Watson," said he, "the whole mechanism laid bare, though we have not yet seen the hand that built it. Institutions such as this do not truly examine the men who pass through them. They examine only the coats those men wear and the names attached to their introduction. A stranger who arrives with the proper satchel, the proper manner, and the endorsement of a respected name will be admitted to rooms that a policeman himself might struggle to enter, and will be remembered afterward, if he is remembered at all, chiefly by the impression he was careful to create rather than by any feature of his own person. You believe this Ashby altered the warrant?" "I believe Ashby's presence in that office during precisely the fortnight surrounding the warrant's sealing is a coincidence too convenient to be accidental. Consider the picture now before us. A substitute clerk, introduced under an assumed name by a man of unimpeachable reputation, occupies a position of trust for a fortnight, and vanishes the very day his cover is no longer required. During that fortnight, a legal document is altered with a skill suggesting long familiarity with such work, in a hand that carries continental habits, and the blame is afterward directed by means of a rehearsed witness and a conveniently remembered phrase toward a grieving young woman whose foreign extraction made her an object of suspicion ready-made. I confess the shape of the thing was beginning to disturb me considerably. But if this Ashby was Ven's creature, I said, surely Ven himself becomes the object of your suspicion, and yet you questioned him yesterday with no more warmth than you showed to Miss March. I questioned him with exactly the warmth his answers deserved, Holmes replied, which is to say, very little, since he anticipated every question before I had finished asking it, and answered each with a completeness that a wholly innocent man, occupied with matters of his own, would rarely trouble to prepare. Innocence is frequently vague upon points of no personal importance to itself, Watson. It is guilt, or the anticipation of suspicion, that furnishes a man with dates and particulars before he is asked for them. We walked on some way in silence, the fog beginning to gather thickly about the lamp-posts, before Holmes spoke again, in a tone more reflective than I had yet heard him use upon this case. "It is a curious feature of the respectable world," said he, "that it recognises a man far more readily by his coat, his signature, and his habitual place among his fellows than by any true acquaintance with his face. A society such as St. Aldwyn's is built entirely upon this convenient blindness. Its members vouch for one another, not because they have examined each other closely, but because to demand such examination would itself seem an insult to the very respectability they exist to celebrate. I begin to think, Watson, that the false clerk who sat at that desk for a fortnight was never intended to deceive posterity. He was intended only to occupy a chair for a very few critical hours, long enough to redirect every eye in the building toward a weeping woman in a foreign veil, while the true business of the alteration was quietly accomplished behind a name no one thought to question. "And that name is Ven's," I said. Holmes did not answer directly, but drew his coat closer against the thickening fog. "That name," said he, "is the one I intend to examine next, though I would remind you, Watson, that a solicitor's whole profession consists in the careful construction of appearances that will withstand exactly this sort of scrutiny. We have found the shape of an impostor. We have not yet found the face beneath the mask, and I do not propose to name it until I am certain the face and the mask are indeed the same man." Chapter 7. The Staged Confession. We had scarcely finished breakfast the following morning when a note arrived from Bradstreet, written in a hand so hurried that the inspector's usual careful formality had quite deserted him. Pomeroy, it seemed, had come to the Sessions House at first light and demanded to see the officer in charge, declaring that his conscience would no longer permit him to remain silent. We found the clerk seated in the same bare waiting room where we had first examined Lydia Voss, though his manner now was very different from the anxious deference I had before observed in him. He sat with his hands pressed together upon his knees, and his face, pale and drawn, wore the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed his own confession so often in private that the delivery of it in public has become almost a relief. "I can bear it no longer," said he, before Bradstreet had well finished the formalities of the occasion. "It was I who altered the warrant, gentlemen, though I did not do it of my own will. Miss Voss came to me some days before the sealing, and begged me, with tears and promises, to find some way of saving Crowther from the dock. I refused her at first, but she returned again, and offered me money, more money than I have seen in a 12-month, and I was weak, and in debt besides, and I took it." He produced as he spoke a small worn purse of dark leather, which he laid upon the table with the air of a man surrendering the last article of his guilt. "This is what she gave me," he said. "I have not touched it since, for I could not bear the sight of it." Bradstreet examined the purse and its contents with an air of considerable satisfaction, and I confess that Pomeroy's account, delivered as it was with every appearance of shame and reluctance, seemed to close the case as neatly as a well-fitted lock. It explained the access to the office, for Pomeroy's own position gave him ready opportunity. It explained the continental habits in the false hand, for a nervous forger might easily disguise his own writing by borrowing an unfamiliar style, and it explained, or seemed to explain, the witness's earlier account of Lydia Voss upon the stair, since Pomeroy might now be supposed to have exaggerated what he had truly seen in order to shield his own part in the affair, only to find his conscience unequal to the deception at last. Bradstreet declared himself satisfied, and gave orders at once for Lydia Voss to be formally charged as the instigator of the forgery, her earlier denials being now accounted for as the natural falsehoods of a guilty woman protecting herself as best she could. I own that I very nearly accepted the solution myself, so complete did it appear, and so evidently distressed was Pomeroy in the telling of it. Holmes, however, had said nothing throughout the whole recital, and it was this very silence, more than any word he might have spoken, that first roused my own doubt. When Pomeroy had been led away and Bradstreet had departed to set the machinery of prosecution in motion, Holmes remained standing beside the table, turning the small leather purse over in his fingers with the slow, deliberate attention he commonly reserved for objects that had not yet finished speaking to him. "You do not believe him," I said. "I believe he has told a story," Holmes replied, "and told it well, which is not at all the same thing as believing it true. A confession delivered with such exact and convenient completeness, Watson, answering every difficulty we had raised, ought to arouse our suspicion quite as readily as it satisfies our curiosity. Real guilt is rarely so obliging. It confesses unevenly, with gaps and contradictions and sudden silences, for the guilty man is thinking, even as he speaks, of how much he dares to say. This was recited, not confessed." He turned the purse over once more, and then, with the point of his penknife, worked open a small fold in the lining where the leather had been stitched. Within, pressed faintly into the inner surface, was the impression of a mark I had not before noticed. A small device resembling an anchor crossed with a bale hook, stamped so lightly that only a careful eye would have discovered it at all. "What do you make of that?" he asked, holding it to the light. I confessed I could make nothing of it beyond a merchant's trademark of some kind. "It is the mark of the Renner shipping concern," said Holmes quietly. "I noted it upon a consignment note in Fairley's office only yesterday, and it is not a mark one forgets, having so particular a device. This purse, Watson, did not come from Lydia Voss, a young woman living upon the narrow wages of a seamstress. It came, or the money within it came, from some source connected with Josiah Renner, the very man whom Crowther is accused of striking, and whose shipping interests this mark represents." "Then Pomeroy has lied," I said, "and been paid to lie, by someone wishing to close the investigation before it went any further." "That is precisely my reading of the matter," Holmes replied, "though I would go a step further, and suggest that the confession was not merely a lie of Pomeroy's own devising, but a manufactured conclusion, offered to us at the very moment when our questions concerning the false clerk Ashby had begun to press uncomfortably close upon someone's peace of mind, a confession that arrived so promptly and answers so completely every difficulty we ourselves had raised, is not the fruit of a troubled conscience, Watson. It is the fruit of a troubled interest, anxious to see the case closed before its own part in the affair can be examined further." He replaced the purse carefully in his pocket, his expression graver than I had seen it since the case began. "We are closer now than we were an hour ago," said he, "though I confess the shape of the whole design remains imperfectly clear to me. Someone connected with Renner's shipping interests has paid Pomeroy to shield the true forger and to fix the blame beyond all further question upon Lydia Voss. That is a very different matter from a lover's desperate folly, Watson, and I begin to suspect that the tampering of this warrant has very little to do with the quarrel between Crowther and Renner, and a very great deal to do with something Crowther knows, or is believed to know, that certain persons would prefer never came before a jury at all. Chapter 8. The Man Who Was Never There. Holmes spent the 2 days that followed in a fashion that tried my patience considerably, for he would say almost nothing of his movements, departing early each morning in various guises, and returning late with no more than a few cryptic remarks to reward my curiosity. It was only upon the evening of the second day, as we sat before the fire at Baker Street, that he consented at last to lay before me the fruits of his inquiry. "I have been among the shipping offices of the Lower Thames," said he, "and among certain gentlemen there who remember Josiah Renner rather less fondly than his position in society would suggest they ought. It appears, Watson, that some years ago a considerable fraud was practised upon several firms trading in the Eastern Docks, involving forged bills of lading and falsified manifests, by which goods were represented as shipped and paid for, that had, in fact, never left the warehouse at all. The fraud was never fully unravelled, and the persons responsible were never brought to book, though it cost more than one honest merchant his fortune, and drove at least one to a debtor's cell." "And Crowther?" I asked. "Crowther was, at the time, employed as a warehouseman in Renner's own service, and it is my belief, though I cannot yet prove it beyond doubt, that he came into possession, through the ordinary course of his work, of some knowledge that would connect Renner, or some associate of Renner's, to that old fraud. The quarrel that led to Crowther's arrest may have begun over wages, as everyone supposes, but I think it very probable that Crowther, in his anger, let fall some threat or hint of what he knew, and that this hint once made placed him in a position of danger considerably greater than a mere charge of assault. I confess that this seemed to me a great structure to raise upon so slight a foundation, but Holmes waved my objection aside with the assurance of a man who had already tested his theory against a harder evidence than my doubts could furnish. "Consider the purpose the Tampered warrant would serve," said he. "It does not free Crowther. It does not even, in its final effect, alter the charge against him in any way that benefits him, for the true warrant has since been restored to its proper form. What it accomplishes, during the interval of confusion it creates, is delay, Watson. Delay in Crowther's trial, delay in any deposition he might be called upon to give, and delay, above all, in any opportunity for Crowther to speak, under oath and before witnesses, of what he knows concerning the docks. A man who wished to silence Crowther permanently would have taken a shorter and more brutal road. A man who wished only to gain time, while some other matter was quietly arranged, or some other danger removed, would choose exactly the method we have observed, a delay dressed up as a scandal, sufficiently embarrassing to occupy every mind in the case, and sufficiently confused in its authorship to resist quick unravelling. He rose and crossed to his desk, where he had assembled, over the course of his inquiries, a small sheaf of notes and cuttings, which he now spread before me. "I have traced the movements of this false clerk Ashby somewhat further than the Sessions House alone," said he. "He appears to have passed, under various names, through no fewer than 3 legal offices in the past year, always briefly, always with proper introductions, and always in connection, however indirect, with matters touching upon shipping disputes or questions of fraud. A clerk here for a fortnight, a copyist there for 10 days, never long enough to be closely examined, never absent long enough to be missed by the man he temporarily replaced. But surely, I said, if he appeared under different names and different guises, he can scarcely be traced to any single individual." "That was my own difficulty," Holmes admitted, "until I compared the descriptions given by each office in turn. They do not agree upon his hair, which is variously described as fair and dark. They do not agree upon his height, nor upon whether he walked with a slight limp or without one. Disguise, Watson, is easily practised upon such particulars, and a clever man will vary them deliberately, the better to prevent exactly the comparison I have now made. But there is one habit that appears in every account, unvarying through every guise, for it is the sort of habit a man performs without thought, and therefore without the caution he applies to his hair or his gait. And what is that? In every office, without exception, he was observed to remove his left glove before handling papers, while retaining the glove upon his right hand throughout, even when the work required both. One clerk thought it an affectation of fastidiousness. Another supposed he suffered from chilblains. A third took no particular notice of it at all, and remembered it only when I pressed him closely upon every detail of the man's habits at his desk. I own that the significance of this escaped me for a moment, until Holmes, watching my face, supplied the answer himself. You will recall, Watson, that Mr. Charles Venn wears his gloves upon every occasion we have met him, indoors as well as out, a habit I remarked at the time but did not then press to its conclusion. I have since made discreet inquiry among his own household, and learned that Venn suffered some years ago an injury to his right hand, an old ink stain driven deep beneath the skin by some accident with a broken pen, which he has ever since kept concealed beneath a glove, accounting it a disfigurement unbecoming to a man in his profession. The fire had burned low, and in its dying light I saw upon Holmes's face an expression I had come to know well, the settled satisfaction of a man who has at last fitted the final piece into a pattern long suspected but never before complete. Venn introduced Ashby to the Sessions House with his own personal recommendation, he continued. Venn's chambers lie within a few minutes' walk of every office through which this false clerk has passed. And Venn, alone among every person we have examined in this affair, possesses both the legal knowledge to know exactly what alterations a committal warrant would require to serve his purpose, and the old, hidden connection to the very fraud that Crowther's testimony threatens to expose. I believe, Watson, that Charles Venn built the false clerk with his own hands as carefully as another man might build a false floor or a hidden drawer, not to deceive the world forever, but to serve a single narrow purpose, and to vanish the moment that purpose was accomplished. It remains only to draw him out into the open, and to do that, I think we shall require the presence of every person this case has touched, gathered together beneath one roof, where a man who has built his safety upon the inattention of others may at last discover what it is to be closely watched. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the constructed identity. It was upon Holmes's particular request that Mrs. Hudson arranged our sitting room to receive so numerous a company, and I confess that when the evening appointed for the gathering at last arrived, I looked about me at the assembled figures with something of the sensation one feels upon watching the final act of a drama whose earlier scenes one has witnessed only in fragments. Fairley sat nearest the fire, pale and uneasy. Bradstreet occupied a chair by the door, his notebook already open upon his knee. Lydia Voss, released upon Holmes's own representation to the authorities, sat close beside Miss March, who'd constituted herself the young woman's protector for the occasion. Reverend Sykes stood gravely near the window. Pomeroy sat apart from the rest, his eyes upon the floor, and Mr. Charles Venn, arriving last of all, greeted the company with the same easy composure I had observed in him from our very first meeting, and took the chair Holmes indicated with no more than a faint courteous inquiry as to the purpose of so unusual an assembly. "The purpose," said Holmes, taking his stand before the fireplace where he might command a view of every face in the room, "is to correct an injustice that has very nearly been done, and to name the true author of a deception that has cost one innocent woman her liberty, and very nearly her reputation besides." He turned first to Bradstreet. "You believed, Inspector, upon evidence that seemed at the time entirely sufficient, that Miss Voss altered the committal warrant in a fit of desperate love, entering Fairley's office in disguise and forging the document with her own hand. I ask you now to consider how thin that evidence truly was. The accent a single witness professed to hear was, upon close examination, a detail he could not himself describe with any consistency. The veil and the dark dress were commonplace enough to fit half the women in London, and the phrase attributed to Miss Voss by Reverend Sykes, though doubtless spoken in a moment of despair, was the sort of extravagant declaration that grief produces in every generation, and proves nothing beyond the depth of her attachment to Crowther. Lydia Voss had begun to weep quietly, and Miss March took her hand, while Reverend Sykes shifted uncomfortably where he stood. The handwriting itself, Holmes continued, was never Miss Voss's. It showed habits of continental training that she does not possess, as any comparison with her own correspondence would readily have shown, had anyone thought to make it, and the clothing description given by the witness Pomeroy was not observed at all, but planted in his memory beforehand. For a man does not forget the very detail he claims first drew his attention, unless that detail was supplied to him rather than seen by him. Pomeroy did not raise his eyes, and I saw his hands tighten upon his knees. "As for the confession," said Holmes, drawing from his pocket the small leather purse, "it was purchased, not given freely. Within the lining of this purse is stamped, faintly but unmistakably, the trademark of the Renner shipping concern, a mark I have since confirmed by comparison with documents in that firm's own offices. The money that bought Pomeroy's confession did not come from Lydia Voss, whose means could never have furnished such a sum. It came from an interest connected to the very man whose quarrel with Abel Crowther first brought this matter before the courts." Bradstreet's pencil had ceased its motion upon the notebook, and he looked now from Pomeroy to Venn with the dawning discomfort of a man who sees his own conclusions beginning to dissolve beneath him. "The true purpose of the alteration," Holmes went on, "was never to free Crowther, nor to punish him further, but to delay his trial, and with it any occasion upon which he might be called to speak, under oath, of certain matters touching the docks. Some years ago, gentlemen, a considerable fraud was practised upon several honest shipping firms by means of forged manifests and falsified bills of lading. That fraud was never resolved, and I believe Abel Crowther, in the course of his employment, came into knowledge that would connect it to persons whose respectability has, until this evening, protected them entirely from suspicion." He turned now, for the first time, his gaze resting directly upon Venn, whose expression had not altered by so much as a flicker, though I fancied I saw his gloved hands close a little more firmly upon the arms of his chair. The alteration of the warrant was accomplished not by Miss Voss, nor by Pomeroy acting alone, but by a false clerk, introduced under the name of Ashby into the Sessions House during Pomeroy's illness, upon the personal recommendation of a solicitor whose word no one thought to question. This same false clerk has appeared, under other names, in at least 2 further legal offices this past year, always briefly, always in connection with matters touching shipping fraud, always vanishing the moment his purpose was served. His descriptions vary in every particular but one. In every office he removed the glove from his left hand before touching paper, and kept the glove upon his right hand throughout, whatever the inconvenience. A silence had fallen upon the room so complete that I heard, quite distinctly, the small settling sound of coal shifting in the grate. "You wear your gloves indoors, Mr. Venn. Upon every occasion I have had the honour of meeting you," Holmes said quietly, "a habit you have never troubled to explain, and which I might myself have thought no more than personal fastidiousness, had I not learned, through discreet inquiry among your own household, that you carry beneath that right glove an old ink stain, driven deep into the skin some years ago by an accident with a broken pen, a disfigurement you have always been at pains to conceal." Venn's composure, which had held through every earlier accusation, broke at last, not into any violent protest, but into a stillness more telling than words, his eyes fixed upon Holmes with the look of a man calculating, even now, whether some further avenue of denial remained open to him. "You introduced Ashby to the Sessions House yourself," Holmes said. "You recommended him elsewhere under other names. You possess the legal knowledge to know precisely what alterations a committal warrant would require, and you possess, above every other person in this room, the oldest and deepest reason to see Abel Crowther silenced before he could speak. Pomeroy was your instrument, bribed with money bearing the mark of interest you serve, first to bear false witness against an innocent woman, and afterward to confess to a crime he had not truly committed. that the investigation might close before it drew any nearer to yourself. "This is conjecture," Venn said at last, his voice steady but pitched lower than before. "Ingenious conjecture, Mr. Holmes, but conjecture none the less. A glove, a purse, the varying memory of frightened clerks, these are not proofs upon which any court would convict a man of my standing." "They are not proofs in themselves," Holmes agreed, with a composure that seemed, to my ear, more unsettling to Venn than any heat of accusation could have been. "But they are threads, Mr. Venn and I have found, in a long experience of such matters, that a sufficient number of threads drawn together will bind even the most respectable of men. Inspector Bradstreet has, I think, already dispatched a constable to your chambers, where certain papers relating to the old shipping fraud, and certain correspondence with the false Ashby under his various names, are, even as we speak, being examined by more official eyes than my own." It was at this that Venn's stillness broke at last, and I saw in his face for one unguarded instant the true measure of the man who had built, with such patience and such care, an identity that had deceived an entire respectable circle, and who now, in the small compass of my sitting-room, watched that careful construction fall away from him like a coat too long worn and suddenly too heavy to sustain. Chapter 10. Reputations Corrected. Venn was taken into custody that same night, offering no further resistance beyond a single request, made in a voice quite unlike his former easy courtesy, that he might be permitted to send word to his clerk before the chambers were sealed. Bradstreet, to his credit, granted the request with a gravity that suggested even he, hardened as he was to such scenes, felt something of the strangeness of watching so respectable a figure led away between two constables. The papers discovered at Venn's chambers that same evening left little room for further doubt. Among them were drafts, in Venn's own concealed hand, of correspondence addressed to the false Ashby under two of his several names, together with fragments of the old shipping manifests whose forgery had never until now been traced to any single author. It became clear, in the days that followed, that Venn had been the architect of the fraud practised years before upon the honest merchants of the Eastern Docks, and that Abel Crowther, then a warehouseman in Renner's employ, had stumbled upon evidence of it in the ordinary course of his duties, evidence he had kept to himself out of caution, or perhaps out of simple bewilderment as to its significance, until his quarrel with Renner threatened to bring the whole matter, however unintentionally, before a court of law. Pomeroy's part in the affair proved upon examination to be one of weakness rather than malice. He had been in debt to a money-lender of unsavoury reputation, a circumstance Venn had discovered and exploited with the same careful attention he had brought to every other detail of his scheme, and when confronted at last with the full weight of the evidence against him, the young clerk broke down entirely and gave testimony that confirmed, in every essential particular, the structure Holmes had already laid before us. In consideration of this cooperation, and of the genuine distress he showed at the harm his falsehoods had brought upon Lydia Voss, the authorities dealt with him more leniently than his conduct might otherwise have deserved. Lydia Voss herself was, of course, entirely cleared, and I had the satisfaction, some days later, of seeing her reunited with Abel Crowther, whose original committal warrant fairly restored to its proper form with his own hand, striking through the false alterations with a care that seemed, to my eye, almost an act of penance for the trust his office had so nearly betrayed. Crowther's trial, when it came at last, proceeded upon the true and original charge, and I am glad to record that the jury, weighing the provocation Renner's own conduct had offered, dealt with him a good deal more gently than the shipping agent's earlier confidence had led him to expect. The respectable circle of St. Aldwyn's Benevolent Association did not escape the affair unshaken. Reverend Sykes called upon us at Baker Street some days after Venn's arrest, and confessed to Holmes, with the heavy solemnity that marked all his utterances, that he had judged Lydia Voss too quickly and too harshly, mistaking the extremity of her grief for evidence of guilt, when it had been, in truth, nothing more than the extremity of her love. "I have learned," said he, "that a phrase spoken in despair may be repeated afterward in a very different light than that in which it was uttered, and that a chaplain, of all men, ought to have remembered how easily grief mimics guilt to eyes already disposed to find it. Miss March, by contrast, required no such lesson, having defended Lydia Voss from the very first with a constancy that did her great credit, and she took it upon herself, in the weeks that followed, to see that the young woman's character was as publicly restored as it had been publicly doubted, writing letters to every quarter of the society that had once entertained suspicion of her. Fairly, for his part, called upon us a final time before the case was fully closed, and I confess I had rarely seen a man so thoroughly humbled by an experience that had, in the end, cost him nothing beyond a measure of his own complacency. "I believed," said he, seating himself in the chair he had occupied at our very first interview, "that the respectability of my colleagues was itself a kind of proof against wrongdoing, Mr. Holmes, and I see now how dangerous a belief that was. Venn moved among us for years, trusted absolutely, precisely because none of us thought to ask what lay beneath so smooth a surface." "It is the oldest error in the world," Holmes replied, "and I do not think you will be the last man to commit it, Mr. Fairley, for society has no other convenient method of conducting its business than to trust the coat a man wears and the company he keeps. I would say only this in your defence: that procedure, however careful, is never a substitute for vigilance, and that a system which asks only whether a man looks like what he claims to be will always, sooner or later, admit a man who has taken the trouble to look correctly." Fairley took his leave not long afterward, and I confess that when the door had closed behind him, I found myself turning the whole strange business over in my mind, from the pleasant dinner at which it had first announced itself, through the tangled threads of thread and wax and violet scent, to the final unmasking beneath our own roof. "It is a curious case, Holmes," I said at last, "for a case in which no blow was struck and no life directly threatened. And yet I do not think I have followed one with greater unease. That is because it touches upon a fear more persistent than any dagger in the dark, Watson," Holmes replied, knocking out his pipe against the grate. "We armour ourselves against the stranger, the ruffian, the face we do not know, and rightly so. But Venn taught us this past fortnight that the truest danger to a respectable world lies not in the men it watches, but in the men it has already agreed not to watch at all, the ones who have earned, through long and patient cultivation, the right to pass unquestioned through every door that matters. Society asks only whether a man looks like what he claims to be. It very rarely asks whether the claim itself was ever true. I thought of Fairley's stricken face, of Lydia Voss's tears turned at last from grief to gratitude, and of Venn's own composure dissolving before us like frost before a fire, and I understood more clearly than any formal summation could have taught me that in the case of the Tampered Committal Warrant, my friend had corrected a great deal more than a single legal document. He had corrected the reputations of the innocent, restored to them by the same close and patient observation that had, in the end, exposed the false and carefully constructed respectability of the guilty.